This year marks the 100th anniversary of U.S. airmail service. To commemorate this historic event, the U.S. Postal Service is issuing a special stamp to honor this occasion. This stamp celebrates the courage of the pioneering airmail carriers and the foresight of those who fostered the new service and made it a success.
I am particularly excited about the airmail stamp because I have an affiliation with the College Park Airport, and which also has a tie-in with the airmail story. So we are incredibly excited to see this first day of issue of a forever airmail centennial stamp, because it really is what started the beginning of our commercial airlines and travel. Like, before the U.S. Postal Service decided to try to figure out how to send mail faster, nobody was doing it. So where would we be had the U.S. Postal Service not decided to say, how can we make this faster? So I just think it's amazingly cool, and we're honored to be here today to be a part of it.
With us is Sydney, who has a very special story because her grandfather flew airmail.
Robert Shank flew airmail, was one of the first 4 civilian airmail pilots that flew in August of 1918, flew airmail between Philadelphia and New York.
And were there any stories your family shared with you?
Well, he was the only one of the 4 who survived in enough to be married and have children and have grandchildren like myself. The other 4 all perished, 1 of natural causes and 2 of airplane accidents from the day. There are lots and lots of stories that they flew without instruments. They flew. They were required to attempt to take off in all weather, even if it was foggy, rainy, and that's why it was so 25% of them died in the delivery of the mail. But he survived.
Airmail gets its start in 1918 here at the DC Polo Grounds. Was the first flight on May 15th, 1918. And then within 2 months, the actual United States Postal Service took over airmail services from the U.S. Army. And that is when they shifted all the operations for the U.S. Postal Service airmail service out to the College Park Airport, in part because it already had facilities in place. It was an active airport. It had hangars. It was right next to the railroad, so it made a great location to service the airmail, and it already had the runways in place.
Today is a very important day in aviation history, not just postal history. It is the day for the first regularly scheduled airmail service in the world, and the U.S. pulled that off. The Post Office and the Army worked together. The Army provided the pilots and the planes. Post Office provided everything else, the hangars, the gas, the fields, all of that. And it took months to put this all together, which usually it would have taken years. The pilots, the Army pilots, put their planes together 2 days before this all started on the 15th. So everybody was rushing around getting it done because they had a deadline to make, and they made it. And the first day went off almost without a hitch. They had 1 pilot. The pilot who left from Washington ended up in Waldorf, Maryland, instead of Philadelphia. But the other, Torrey Webb going out of New York, did great. Paul Culver carried the mail from Philadelphia to New York, and James Edgerton from Philadelphia down to DC. They all did a fabulous job, and over the next 3 months, the Army pilots were fabulous. There were a few crashes, and a few times when they didn't want to go up because of bad weather, and the post office said, "You have to go up, it's the mail." But they turned everything over to the post office department in August, and August 12th moved over to College Park. And at that point, the post office was in full control of everything. And it's amazing because you think about the creation of an commercial aviation system in America or in any country. Ours was created and funded by the Post Office Department. That is utterly unique. And it was amazing. Without the Post Office Department's funds, without creating the flyways, without training the pilots, without all the substructure that they created, commercial aviation would have been struggling for decades to get off the ground. But instead, they had basically a stepstone. They were, given all this stuff from the Post Office Department. And when they finally, turned everything over to the contractors, then the Post Office started doing mail contracts and paying them to carry the mail because nobody was riding them on the planes. It was too dangerous. But they would carry the mail, so that funded them to keep going. And that was critically important. You had people like Boeing, who was thinking about going back to making furniture, because after the war ended, nobody was buying planes. And so now you have this post office who's funding planes, buying planes, then funding the new airlines. And guess what happened to Boeing? It's amazing what the post office did. And a lot of people don't realize that, the companies that joined together to become United Airlines, Eastern Airlines, all these different companies were companies that got mail contracts in the early years. And postal pilots that were so good at what they did were the first ones snapped up by the contractors. They grabbed them when they could. Two pilots, Jack Knight and E. Hamilton Lee, were two of the best. They ended up being snapped up by Varney, which then turned into United Airlines. And they both flew until the 1940s, which was kind of unique. Most of the pilots didn't live quite that long. And many of the pilots, actually 32 of the pilots, died while they were applying the mail for the post office during the 9 years that the post office was operating it. And many pilots died after that for the contractors. And you think, dying for mail, oh my God, who would do that? But we're looking at a time period where the only communication medium was mail. That's it. Unless you were rich, you weren't sending telegrams or having telephones. Mail was it for basically 200 years of our lives. And when airmail came along and speeded things up, it was just tremendous for banks and businesses and governments and individuals. But then you had these pilots who understood that relationship between mail and the people and understood that mail was a sacred thing. And they would risk their lives for it, and they did. And some of them died. It's just it's stunning when you stop to think about it.
My name is Chris Karpenko, and I am the Executive Director of Brand Marketing for the United States Postal Service. I'm honored to serve you as Master of Ceremonies this morning, as the Postal Service dedicates the first of two stamps being issued this year commemorating the 100th anniversary of the U.S. airmail service. Today's stamp is colored in blue and celebrates the inaugural months of airmail service performed with planes helmed by Army pilots. The second stamp, colored in red, will be issued this summer. That stamp will honor the transfer of airmail service to the Post Office Department.
It is hard to imagine that it has been almost 100 years since the first airmail flights began. I don't think anybody could have imagined the significance of those flights would have on future air travel. Today's commercial aviation industry is a direct result of the Post Office's vision a century ago, and the brave pilots who wanted to be part of that history-making milestone. The Postal Service has played major roles in the development of our nation over the past 200 years, maybe none more important than the one we are celebrating today. For the past 25 years, our museum has been dedicated to telling those stories, presenting the history of our nation through the unique lens of postal history and stamps. In celebration of that 100th anniversary, today we opened our Postman of the Skies exhibition, celebrating the postal airmail service and the brave pilots who flew the mail. The early years of the nation's airmail service are filled with dynamic individuals and fascinating stories. Our new exhibition invites visitors to witness and experience the birth of commercial aviation. Actually, one of the pilots featured in the exhibition flew the de Havilland DH-4 airplane that hangs above our heads right here. Remarkable stories, remarkable artifacts, and a remarkable chapter in American history. I hope you enjoyed today's celebration and have an opportunity to enjoy all that our museum has to offer. Enjoy the stories about the planes hanging over our heads, as well as the remarkable stories celebrating the 100th anniversary of the first airmail flight. Thank you.
Today's stamp celebrates the pioneering spirit of the Army pilots who initiated airmail service on May 15, 1918, and of the many other pilots who followed their example in the early years of flying. This groundbreaking service is credited with establishing the foundation for America's modern-day aviation industry. The Wright brothers opened this country's eyes to what could be possible. 15 years later, with the first airmail flights, the post office helped turn that possibility into a reality. Always changing, always innovating. These words are emblazoned on the entrance of the United States Postal Service headquarters in Washington, D.C. They describe an organization willing to embrace technology and invention. What is true today for the Postal Service is just as true for the Post Office Department 100 years ago. One might question how many different ways there are to deliver the mail. I can tell you that the Postal Service has tried almost every conceivable way. We transport the mail using trucks and vans. Our carriers deliver by foot and on bike. We've carried the mail on trains and on boats, by mule and by stagecoach. For decades in Alaska, customers got their mail by way of dog sled. Now some mail goes there by hovercraft. Motorcycles and buses have also been a part of the postal fleet. The Postal Service has also experimented with segways. One of the more ingenious methods of delivery was the practice of shuttling mail within large cities through underground pneumatic tubes. After World War II, Postmaster General Arthur Summerfield even tried delivering mail by missile. He went so far as to declare, before man reaches the moon, mail will be delivered within hours from New York to California, to Britain, to India, or Australia by guided missiles. We stand on the threshold of rocket mail. While the potential of rocket mail may not have taken off, and pardon the pun on that, the concept of aerial delivery was not a new one to the post office. The idea of getting mail from one place to another through the skies gave birth to airmail in the United States in 1918. Airmail service has been one of our organization's most significant contributions to America's growth. Single-person flights carrying bags of mail from one city to another eventually led to a world-shaping passenger aviation industry and transportation network. After years of lobbying, airmail was given the green light. The U.S. Army and the Post Office Department made arrangements to work together to get the new service up and running. On May 15, 1918, the first airmail route between Washington, D.C. and New York made its debut. Simultaneous flights by Army pilots departed from Long Island and Washington, with Philadelphia as a stop in between. The flights, witnessed by hundreds of dignitaries, were deemed a success. The story of airmail made front-page news and history. Few pilots at the time had any long-distance flight training, and there was no reliable instrumentation to guide them. Bad weather often caused forced landings. Only later would flying at night become a possibility. Well, despite the daily hazards of flying, the Army succeeded in making airmail flights routine. But with a war to fight, the Army transferred operation of the service to the Post Office the following August. Post Office officials bought and ordered planes, hired pilots to fly them, and mapped out airmail routes across the country. As the service grew, the Post Office created and upgraded airfields along the air routes. In 1920, the Post Office began installing radio stations at each field to provide pilots with weather updates. Aircraft were outfitted with new equipment to prepare for the challenges of flying by night. Luminescent instruments, navigational lights, and parachute flares were added to the planes. Charles Stanton, an early airmail pilot and later head of the Civil Aeronautics Administration, had the following to say about the early days of airmail service. We planted 4 seeds. They were the airways, communications, navigation aids, and multi-engined aircraft. They are the cornerstones on which our present worldwide transport structure is built. And they came one by one out of our experience in daily, uninterrupted flying of the mail.
On a blustery Wednesday morning, thousands crowded around a roped-off space in Potomac Park. President Wilson, Postmaster General Burleson, and other political and postal officials were on hand to watch the world's first regularly scheduled airmail service. Burleson had arranged this day with Secretary of War Baker, and 4 Army pilots were ready to fly the mail in Army planes between Washington and New York, with a stop at Philadelphia for refueling and transferring the mail. Major Reuben Fleet was busy barking orders at his staff, in between posing for photographs and telling the president how the day was going to go. Lieutenant George Boyle, a road map strapped to his leg, was tasked with flying the mail on the Washington to Philadelphia run. While not the Army's best pilot, Boyle was the future son-in-law of the Interstate Commerce Commissioner, which won him this prime spot. Unfortunately for the Post Office, Boyle didn't head north, he headed southeast and crashed in Waldorf, Maryland. His mail was put on a truck to DC and unceremoniously put on a train to New York City. Fortunately for the Post Office Department, the other 3 pilots did a magnificent job that day. 2 days later, Boyle was given a second chance and a guide in a second plane to lead him to Chesapeake Bay with orders to keep the bay on his right and head north. Boyle remembered the first part, but not so much the second. He got to the bay and he followed it around all the way down to Cape Charles, Virginia, a few hours later landing there. Major Fleet later said that the only thing that kept him from going further was the Atlantic Ocean. Boyle never flew the mail again. The other Army pilots kept the service going, and a few months later, the whole system was turned over to the Post Office. By September 1920, planes were carrying mail across the country along a route from New York to Chicago to San Francisco. The postal pilots were a hit. The astronauts of their age, they braved storms and equipment failure. They navigated by rivers and railroads and carried tools for when a forced landing made them their own mechanics and they had to bring a broken piece back to life. They flew by day at first, as there were no beacons or landing lights on airfields. Those who thought they could beat the sun to the next stop did so at their peril. Some pilots were goofy, others serious, but all understood the bargain that they had made, risking their lives to get the mail through. More than 230 pilots worked for the post office. 32 of those pilots died flying that mail. Like other brave individuals, mail pilots often found humor in a bad situation. After crashing into a tree, Sam Eaton filed a report saying that he had delivered the mail to a branch post office. After a forced landing, Dean Smith telegraphed his boss that he had dead-sticked, flying low, only place to land on cow, killed cow, wrecked airplane, scared me. In 1925, the post office began turning its operations over to the private contractors. By 1927, the transformation was complete. While no longer operating the service, the post office supported the fledgling companies with mail contracts, helping to create the nation's commercial aviation system, with many of these planes being flown by the former postal pilots. The post office also turned their pilots' cold weather gear over to the contractors. When pilot Eddie Allen heard about that, he wrote his old boss asking for the gear that he had used to carry the mail over the Rockies. And he quotes, "As an expression of appreciation, for I gave the very best I had in me to the airmail service." Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, and I think particularly now I'd like to call your attention to the year 2018, which is the year that we commemorate the centennial of America's entry into combat during the First World War. Following the war's conclusion in November of 1918, the U.S. Army Air Corps pilots and aircraft maintainers were few in number, but their collective experience and memories had been forged in combat during those 6 crucial months of 1918, when the likes of Benjamin Falloy and Eddie Rickenbacker flew against formidable foes like Manfred von Richthofen and Ernst Udet near Samiel, or skilled aviators like Frank Luke relentlessly attacked enemy forces on the ground near Verdun. The men in those open-aired biplanes thrived on innovation and tactical developments, much of which informed air doctrine through the 1920s and 1930s. Small appropriations for aviation and the Great Depression of the 1930s, however, somewhat stunted the growth of the post-war Air Corps. Despite many precedents and feats of airmanship in the late 20s and early 30s, many aviators found themselves flying bi-winged aircraft not too dissimilar from those that they flew during the First World War, such as the Jenny. And being viewed by the War Department as a peacetime Air Force, the Air Corps had few opportunities to truly test the limits of air power. That changed in February of 1934, when President Roosevelt canceled contracts with commercial airlines to carry mail. Citing inefficiencies within the civilian sectors to haul the U.S. Postal Service's precious cargo, President Roosevelt called upon the man he knew would step up to the task. General Benjamin Falloy, then commander of the Air Corps, gladly accepted the mission and committed the Air Corps to set about devising routes, waypoints, and methods for airmen to efficiently and safely haul the mail. Challenges would be great. Previously, many aviators, as Susan mentioned, rarely flew at night or in bad weather. The early months of 1934 promised both, as marginal weather included severe snowstorms, fog, and wind. A blizzard disrupted the first day's operations from the Rocky Mountains to the East Coast, and icy gales covered most of the country. Unaccustomed to instrument flying in fog or clouds, aviators became disoriented. In those clouds and in those swirling mists, and during the first week of operations alone, a series of accidents claimed the lives of 6 Army flyers. But this didn't dampen the spirits of the pilots who innovated and experimented daily with tactics and landing procedures. After all, what cargo could be more precious than letters to loved ones? Better weather in March, new courses in instrument flying, and innovation in ground maintenance bolstered the Air Corps' confidence, and deliveries drastically improved. By the end of the operation in June, the Air Corps reported a somewhat disappointing 66% sortie completion rate, and 66 aircraft accidents would claim the lives of 12 airmen. Despite what some believe to be a blight on the Air Corps' ability to meet its mission, the airmail operations spurred a great awakening of air power potential, leading to the establishment of General Headquarters Air Corps and development of newer technology and processes. The single-wing, long-range wing monoplane B-10 bombers proved to be one of the safer designs and favorites of the airmail pilots, which prompted the aircraft industry to look at similar designs. These would eventually lead to design such aircraft as the famed DC-3 and the B-17. The airmail episode also led to the development of an automated landing system from radio signals, which would eventually lead to approach control and tactical air navigation. The Air Corps effort similarly prompted President Roosevelt to review all facets of American aviation, which included the establishment of the Federal Aviation Commission. And these and other achievements, born from necessity during the airmail operation, helped redefine the use of aircraft and its role in military doctrine that would be sorely tested in the skies above Europe and the Pacific during the Second World War and beyond. Thank you.
And I'm Kristal Hart reporting from the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. It is right across the street from Union Station, once again here in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed the show.